The heavy brass padlock on the loading dock of Bay 4 was not ours. I stood in the freezing Chicago morning rain, staring at the unfamiliar mechanism, feeling the cold seep through the soles of my boots. For the past 6 years, the architectural salvage warehouse had been secured by a specialized magnetic lock, one that required a fob only my sister Sylvia and I possessed. Now a thick, abrasive chain wrapped around the iron handles of the shipping doors, mocking the entire concept of our shared business. I did not panic immediately. Instead, I walked to the side entrance, used my standard key to bypass the office door, and went straight to the filing cabinet where we kept the outbound freight manifests. The folder for November was completely empty. Our business, preserving and selling historical architectural elements from demolished buildings, was built on meticulous documentation. Every piece of 19th century terracotta, every bronze elevator grill, and every stained glass transom had a provenance file. We needed those files to prove authenticity to the designers and restoration architects who bought from us. Sylvia managed the administrative and financial side, a role she assumed 3 years ago, when a disastrous personal investment left my credit score in ruins. At the time, I needed a guarantor to secure the warehouse lease, and she stepped in. In exchange, she took a 51% controlling interest in the LLC. I was the one crawling through hazardous demolition sites to extract century-old oak mantles, but she was the one who signed the checks. It was a functional if tense arrangement until the gentrification of our industrial district began driving up property values and pushing out the smaller workshops. The first sign that something was shifting beneath my feet occurred 2 months before I found the new padlock. I had spent 3 weeks carefully restoring a set of copper roof finials salvaged from a demolished library. They were easily worth $40,000 to the right buyer. When I came in on a Tuesday to photograph them for our catalogue, the crate was gone. I asked Sylvia about it during our weekly inventory review. She did not look up from her laptop, merely stating that the crate had been damaged during a forklift maneuver by one of the temp workers. The copper was hopelessly crushed, and she had sent it to a scrap metal recycling facility to recoup whatever pennies she could. It made no sense. Copper of that thickness does not simply shatter, and even if it had been dented, it could be reshaped. When I asked for the scrap receipt, she waved me off, saying she had filed it with the quarterly tax write-offs, and that I should focus on the new shipment of doors arriving from Detroit. I let it go because our commercial lease was up for renewal in 60 days. The landlord required both of our signatures to lock in the next 5-year term, and I knew Sylvia was already grumbling about the rising cost of commercial insurance. If I started a fight over a scrapped crate, she could easily walk away, leaving me with no workspace, no inventory, and no legal right to the business assets. My entire livelihood was tied to that building. I swallowed my suspicion and went back to the restoration floor, but I started keeping my own private ledger of high-value inventory. Over the next few weeks, more items vanished. A pair of limestone gargoyles, a complete mahogany library paneling set, and several crates of vintage subway tiles disappeared overnight. Each time, Sylvia had a perfectly mundane administrative excuse. A buyer in New York had prepaid for the tiles, she claimed, though the funds never appeared in our operating account. The mahogany had supposedly developed dry rot and had to be discarded to prevent spreading to our other wood stock. The excuses were plausible enough on the surface, but the volume of loss was staggering. I realized she was bleeding our inventory dry, but I could not figure out how she was moving thousands of pounds of stone and wood without my knowledge, nor where the money was going. I needed to understand the logistics of her operation, so I approached Marcus. Marcus managed the overnight freight logistics for the entire industrial park. He was an independent contractor who operated the heavy-duty forklifts and coordinated the flatbed trucks that serviced the dozen or so warehouses in our block. We had known each other for years, trading coffees and complaints about the brutal Chicago winters. I found him in the break room of the Central Dispatch office, nursing a cup of tea. I asked him casually if he had noticed any unusual truck traffic around Bay 4 after hours. Marcus looked uncomfortable. He stared at his boots, tapping his fingers against his ceramic mug. He told me he couldn't afford to get involved in a dispute between owners, especially since Sylvia was the one who officially signed his monthly retainer checks for our sector. I did not press him for a dramatic confession. I simply pointed out that if Sylvia was moving heavy freight off the books, she was likely bypassing the standard liability insurance protocols for the industrial park. If one of those unregistered flatbeds damaged the loading dock, or worse, if a heavy crate fell and injured someone, Marcus would be the one held responsible by the management company for allowing unlogged freight movement. That shifted his perspective. He did not want to lose his livelihood over my sister's secret transactions. He agreed to let me look at the raw security logs from the loading dock weight sensors, provided I never mentioned his name. The weight logs were the first solid piece of the puzzle. Over the past 8 weeks, a third-party logistics company had backed up to our dock exactly 4 times, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. The sensors recorded the displacement weight. According to the logs, Sylvia had moved out over 18,000 pounds of material. She wasn't just scrapping damaged goods, she was liquidating our most valuable historical assets in bulk. I still needed to know where it was going and why she was doing it now. I could not confront her yet. If I accused her of theft, she would simply lock me out of the LLC accounts entirely, refuse to sign the lease renewal, and sell off the rest of the inventory legally as the majority shareholder. I had to secure my own future before dismantling hers. My strategy began with Hayes, a commercial appraiser who specialized in industrial salvage. I hired him under the guise of updating our insurance policy ahead of the lease renewal. However, I deliberately guided him to appraise the east wing of the warehouse, where I had spent the last week quietly moving our most mediocre, low-value stock: rotted door frames, cracked porcelain sinks, and rusted iron fencing. I needed Hayes to generate a certified official document stating that the remaining inventory in the East Wing was essentially worthless. Hayes was thorough. He noted the poor condition of the items, the lack of market demand, and assigned a dismal valuation to the entire section. He handed me the stamped appraisal, completely unaware that he was helping me build a firewall. With Hayes's appraisal in hand, I went to Sylvia. I played the part of the defeated, financially anxious artisan perfectly. I told her I was worried about the upcoming lease renewal, that the inventory was looking thin, and that the East Wing was practically filled with junk. I showed her the appraisal. I suggested that, to save on insurance premiums for the new lease, we should formally write off the East Wing inventory and reclassify that section of the warehouse as empty storage. Sylvia, seeing an opportunity to lower the overhead while she continued her own secret liquidation, readily agreed. She signed a corporate resolution abandoning the East Wing inventory, effectively removing it from the LLC's protected assets. What Sylvia did not know was that over the following 2 weekends, while she was out of town meeting with her secret buyers, I rented a box truck and systematically swapped the inventory. I moved the genuine high-value assets, the hand-carved staircases, the original brass fixtures and the antique stained glass into the now abandoned East Wing. I replaced them on the main floor with the actual junk that Hayes had appraised. Because she rarely walked the dusty aisles herself, relying instead on her spreadsheets, she never noticed the physical swap. To the LLC's official ledger, the main floor was full of valuable stock and the East Wing was empty. In reality, I had legally isolated the best of our business in a section she had formally signed away, but protecting the inventory was not enough. I needed to expose her fraud to sever her legal hold over me. I dug deeper into the administrative files she kept in the locked office. I spent nights carefully picking the simple lock on her desk drawer, taking photographs of her paperwork, and placing everything exactly as I found it. I discovered a series of inland marine insurance claims. Sylvia had not just sold the copper finials and the mahogany paneling. She had filed claims stating they were destroyed by water damage from a fictitious roof leak. She collected the insurance payouts for the full appraised value of the items, deposited that money into an external account, and then sold the physical items on the black market to a private developer in Boston for pure profit. She was double-dipping, defrauding the insurance company while liquidating the company's assets. The paperwork was sloppy, relying on the fact that the insurance adjuster rarely visited our physical location for claims under $50,000. She had forged my signature on the damage reports. The climax did not happen in a courtroom or during a heated family argument. It happened on a dreary Thursday morning in the conference room of the Commercial Real Estate Management Office, We were scheduled to sign the new 5-year lease. The landlord's representative, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, sat at the head of the table. Sylvia sat next to her looking impatient, holding an expensive pen, ready to bind us to another 5 years of her financial control. Also present, at my specific, quiet invitation, was a regional underwriter for our commercial insurance provider, a man named Mr. Aris, who believed he was there to conduct a routine risk assessment for the new lease term. As Mrs. Gable slid the thick lease contract across the table, Sylvia reached for it. I placed my hand on the document, stopping it. I stated calmly that before we committed to a new term, we needed to clarify the status of our liability coverage, given the recent catastrophic inventory losses. Sylvia frowned, her eyes darting toward Mr. Aris. She told me to stop being dramatic and just sign the paper. I opened my briefcase and pulled out 3 separate folders. I slid the first one to Mr. Aris. It contained the weight logs I had secured from Marcus, cross-referenced with the dates of the alleged water damage. I pointed out that it was physically impossible for £18,000 of waterlogged ruined wood and stone to simply evaporate, yet there were no corresponding disposal receipts or dumpster rental invoices. Instead, there were logs of third-party freight trucks leaving our dock in the middle of the night. I then slid the second folder to Mrs. Gable. It contained the photographs of Sylvia's internal ledgers, showing the wire transfers from the Boston developer, matching the exact descriptions of the items she had claimed as destroyed. Sylvia's face did not contort into rage. It simply went entirely blank. She carefully put her pen down on the table. She looked at the documents, then at me, calculating her next move. She tried to pivot, adopting a tone of calm authority. She claimed these were internal accounting discrepancies, easily explained by disorganized archiving, and completely inappropriate for a lease signing. Mr. Aris did not agree. He looked at the forged signatures on the damage reports, then at me. I handed him my own notarized signature card from my bank, showing a distinct difference in the handwriting. I informed him that I had never seen the damage reports until 3 days ago, and that the LLC's physical inventory had been systematically removed and sold for cash. The room grew incredibly quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed very loud. Mrs. Gable slowly pulled the lease contract back across the table toward herself. She stated that the management company could not enter into a contract with an entity currently under investigation for commercial fraud, as it violated the moral turpitude clause of their standard agreement. Mr. Aris informed Sylvia that his office would be freezing all active policies and initiating a formal investigation into the payouts. Sylvia stood up. She did not scream. She did not apologize. She simply gathered her coat, looked at me with a cold, hollow expression, and walked out of the conference room. She knew she was caught, and her immediate priority was securing whatever funds she had already siphoned before the accounts were frozen. I did not follow her. I remained at the table. Once the door closed, I pulled a third folder from my briefcase. This one contained the incorporation papers for a new business entity, registered entirely in my name, and the formal resolution Sylvia had signed weeks earlier, abandoning the inventory in the East Wing. I explained to Mrs. Gable that while my sister's LLC was effectively dead, I was prepared to sign a new lease for a smaller, different bay in the industrial park, using the clean assets I legally owned as collateral. It took 3 months to untangle the mess. The insurance company pursued Sylvia relentlessly. She managed to avoid prison by agreeing to a massive restitution plan that wiped out her personal savings and the offshore account. The original LLC was dissolved, buried under a mountain of debt and legal fees. I lost a significant amount of money in the transition. I had to cover the legal costs of formally dissolving our partnership, and I lost all the inventory she had managed to ship out before I caught on. But I secured Bay 7, a smaller, colder but entirely independent workspace at the far end of the industrial park. I spent the first week in the new shop organizing the salvaged materials I had saved in the East Wing swap. I carefully catalogued the hand-carved staircases and the antique stained glass under my own new business license. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I finished installing a new, heavy deadbolt on the front door. I tested the key, feeling the satisfying solid click of the mechanism turning. I put the key in my pocket, picked up my restoration tools, and went to work on a piece of century-old oak, finally building something that belonged only to me. The satisfaction of turning that heavy deadbolt on Bay 7 lasted exactly 11 days. I had assumed the insurance company's investigation would keep Sylvia entirely occupied, forcing her to focus on her own survival rather than orchestrating a new offensive against me. I underestimated her capacity for vindictiveness, and more importantly, I underestimated how skillfully she could weaponize our family's long-standing dynamics to rewrite reality. Growing up, Sylvia was always the academic achiever, the one who understood tax codes, investment portfolios, and corporate structures. I was the one who came home with dirt under my fingernails, obsessed with the history of buildings and the preservation of physical things. To our parents, and by extension our entire network of aunts, uncles, and cousins, Sylvia was the infallible, grounded professional. I was the chaotic artisan who fundamentally required her supervision just to function in the real world. When the original LLC collapsed and the insurance fraud investigation began, Sylvia did not retreat into silence. Instead, she executed a preemptive social strike. Before I even had the chance to explain to our parents why the business was dissolving, Sylvia called an impromptu family meeting at our mother's house. I was deliberately excluded. During that dinner, she spun a masterful, devastating lie. She told them that the business was failing due to my poor inventory management and erratic spending. She claimed that, in a desperate bid to steal the remaining valuable assets and start my own company, I had fabricated a paper trail of insurance fraud and handed it to the underwriters to force her out of the industry. Because the family already viewed me as the irresponsible sibling, her narrative took root instantly. She painted herself as the betrayed sister, financially ruined by my greed, and now facing unjust legal battles. The fallout was immediate and suffocating. My phone began ringing the next morning. Our mother called first, her voice thick with a mixture of disappointment and anger, demanding that I immediately return the inventory I had stolen from my sister and drop the ridiculous accusations I had made to the insurance board. When I tried to explain the weight logs, the offshore accounts, and the forged signatures, she simply talked over me, stating that Sylvia had already showed them the real ledgers. By the end of the week, I was completely ostracized. My cousins blocked me on social media. My uncle, who had previously offered to help me move some of the heavier salvage into Bay 7, sent a terse text message stating he could not support someone who would destroy their own flesh and blood for a payout. I was entirely isolated, painted as a thief in my own family, while the actual thief was receiving emotional support and financial loans from our parents to help pay her mounting legal retainers. The social humiliation was a heavy burden, but it was only the vanguard of Sylvia's actual strategy. The family's sympathy was merely a tool to secure the funds she needed to launch a civil lawsuit against me. 3 weeks into my isolation, a process server walked through the doors of Bay 7 and handed me a thick stack of legal documents. Sylvia was suing me and my newly formed corporation for corporate sabotage, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent transfer of assets. She was petitioning the court to pierce the corporate veil of my new business and seize the inventory in Bay 7, arguing that the assets I had moved were done so under false pretenses and rightfully belonged to the original LLC, which she still controlled on paper, despite its frozen status. Her lawyer had filed an emergency injunction to freeze my business operations. If the judge granted it, I would not be able to sell a single piece of salvaged wood or stone. Without cash flow, I would default on the new lease for Bay 7 within 2 months. Sylvia didn't just want to avoid the consequences of her fraud, she wanted to drag me down with her, liquidating my legitimate new business to pay off her restitution to the insurance company. I sat alone in the cold expanse of Bay 7, looking at the summons. I realized then that exposing her to the commercial real estate manager and the insurance underwriter had not been the end of the war. It had only shifted the battlefield. I needed to dismantle her civil suit before the injunction hearing, but I was severely outmatched financially. Sylvia was using our parents' retirement savings to fund a ruthless corporate litigator, while I was operating on a shoestring budget, barely keeping the lights on in the new warehouse. I could not afford a protracted legal discovery process. I needed irrefutable proof that would not only destroy her lawsuit, but also shatter the false narrative she had fed our family, a narrative she was now trying to submit into the public court record. I began reviewing every piece of evidence I had gathered during my initial investigation, looking for something I had missed. I went back over the photographs of her ledgers, the freight logs, and the forged insurance claims. The insurance company already had all of this, and they were prosecuting her for the payout fraud. But the civil court judge overseeing her lawsuit against me wouldn't necessarily wait for the outcome of the criminal insurance fraud investigation before ruling on the injunction. I needed something that proved specifically that her relinquishment of the East Wing inventory was an act of calculated deceit, not a mistake induced by my alleged sabotage. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the digital metadata of the commercial appraisal. When I had hired Hayes to appraise the East Wing, I had assumed his official stamped document was the ultimate shield. It was the document Sylvia used to legally abandon the assets. But as I reviewed the PDF of the appraisal on my laptop, I noticed the timestamp of the file's creation. Hayes had emailed me the final appraisal on a Tuesday afternoon. However, when I dug back into the photographs I had taken of Sylvia's private desk files, I found a printed email exchange between Sylvia and the Boston developer. She was negotiating the sale of the vintage subway tiles and the mahogany paneling, the exact items she claimed were ruined. I cross-referenced the dates. Sylvia had initiated the sale of those high-value items, promising delivery to Boston, a full 48 hours before Hayes even set foot in our warehouse to conduct the appraisal. She couldn't have been tricked by my appraisal into abandoning the assets because she had already sold them on the black market 2 days prior. She signed the corporate resolution abandoning the East Wing, not because I manipulated her, but because she believed those specific assets were already on a truck to Massachusetts, and she was simply clearing the books to cover her tracks. The timeline proved premeditation, and it completely invalidated her claim that I had stolen the inventory out from under her after the appraisal. The inventory she had intended to abandon was the valuable stock she thought she had already fenced. But a photograph of an email taken during a covert search of her desk would likely be challenged in court as inadmissible or fabricated. I needed the actual verified communication. I needed the Boston developer. The architectural salvage industry is surprisingly small, and moving 18,000 pounds of historical materials across state lines leaves a distinct logistical footprint. I could not simply call the Boston developer and ask him to confess to buying stolen goods. I had to locate him first, and I had to find a point of leverage that would compel him to hand over his private correspondence with my sister. I spent the next 4 days cross-referencing commercial building permits issued in the greater Boston area over the last 3 months, specifically looking for historic renovations that matched the scale of the mahogany paneling and the vintage subway tiles. It was tedious, eye-straining work, but I eventually found a match, a boutique hotel renovation in the Back Bay district, overseen by a mid-sized commercial firm. I did not hire a lawyer to make the contact. I bought a cheap flight to Boston, walked directly into the developer's temporary site office and introduced myself. I presented him with the original authentic provenance files for the mahogany paneling, the very files Sylvia had claimed were lost in the fictitious water damage event. The developer, a pragmatic man named Vance, was immediately defensive. He produced a bill of sale signed by Sylvia, insisting he had purchased the materials legally. I did not accuse him of theft. I calmly laid out the reality of the situation. I explained that the items were the subject of an active multi-state insurance fraud investigation and a bitter civil lawsuit. I told him that within a matter of weeks, the insurance underwriters would likely seek a federal injunction to seize the paneling directly from his hotel walls as stolen evidence. However, I offered a compromise. As the co-founder of the original LLC, I still retained the legal standing to sign a waiver of title dispute. If Vance provided me with the complete, unedited email chains and the wire transfer records detailing his negotiations with Sylvia, specifically the dates showing when the transaction was initiated, I would sign the waiver, legally insulating his firm from the insurance company's seizure efforts. Vance did not care about my family drama. He only cared about keeping his renovation on schedule. He had his IT director pull the server logs, printed the entire correspondence, and handed me the leverage I needed. The preliminary injunction hearing took place on a dreary Tuesday morning in a cramped, heavily paneled courtroom in downtown Chicago. Sylvia sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by the expensive corporate litigator funded by our parents' retirement accounts. Our mother and father sat in the gallery right behind her, offering silent, unwavering support. I sat alone at the defense table. Because I could not afford an attorney for a civil defense, I was representing myself pro se. The judge, a tired-looking man with a stack of files in front of him, clearly expected this to be a routine business dispute between bitter siblings. Sylvia's lawyer spoke first, delivering a polished, emotionally manipulative narrative. He painted me as an opportunistic saboteur who had deliberately falsified an appraisal to trick my sister into abandoning valuable assets, essentially stealing the lifeblood of the company out from under her. He formally requested that the court freeze the assets in my new warehouse Bay 7, pending a full trial. When it was my turn to speak, I did not launch into a defense of my character. I simply approached the bench and submitted 3 copies of a single evidentiary packet. I handed one to the judge, one to the court clerk, and one to Sylvia's lawyer. The packet contained the certified email chains from Vance, the wire transfer receipts, and my own sworn affidavit detailing the timeline. I directed the judge's attention to the dates. I explained that my sister could not possibly have been tricked into abandoning the East Wing inventory by the commercial appraisal, because the emails proved she had already negotiated the sale of those exact items, collected the cash, and scheduled the freight trucks 48 hours before the appraiser ever walked through our doors. She signed the abandonment resolution, not because she thought the items were worthless, but because she believed the valuable items were already gone, and she needed to clear the company ledger to mask her black market sale. I watched Sylvia's lawyer read the emails. His professional composure fractured. He flipped back to the timestamp, then looked sharply at his client. Sylvia's face drained of color. She realized instantly that these were not internal documents she could dismiss as my fabrications. These were communications from her own buyer, completely dismantling the foundation of her lawsuit. The judge spent a long time reading the exchange. When he finally looked up, the boredom was entirely gone from his expression. He denied the emergency injunction immediately. Furthermore, he informed Sylvia and her attorney that, given the timeline presented in the authenticated emails, the civil complaint she had filed appeared to be demonstrably false. He stated for the official record that he was forwarding the hearing transcripts and the new evidence directly to the district attorney's office to be attached to the ongoing insurance fraud investigation, strongly suggesting they review the matter for perjury and malicious prosecution. The gavel fell, dismissing the hearing. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I gathered my files and placed them carefully into my briefcase. As I walked down the center aisle, our parents stood up from the gallery. The certainty they had carried into the room was entirely shattered. Our mother reached out, her hand trembling, opening her mouth to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a demand for an explanation of how everything had gone so terribly wrong. I did not stop to listen. I looked at her, offered a brief polite nod of acknowledgement, and kept walking through the heavy wooden doors. The family I had known was gone, dismantled not by my actions, but by the undeniable weight of the truth they had refused to see. The financial and social cost of the victory was steep. I never saw a dime of the money Sylvia stole, and our parents' retirement savings were decimated by her legal fees and the subsequent fines she faced. I stopped attending family gatherings entirely. The quiet isolation that followed was initially painful, but it gradually morphed into a profound sense of clarity. 6 months later, the bitter Chicago winter had faded into a mild spring. I stood in the center of Bay 7, the high ceilings echoing with the low hum of the industrial ventilation fans. The warehouse was no longer empty. It was meticulously organized, filled with centuries-old terracotta, pristine brass fixtures, and heavy timber beams. I walked over to my workbench, where a set of severely tarnished late 19th century copper roof finials sat waiting. They were not the ones Sylvia had stolen, but a new set I had successfully outbid a major firm to acquire. I picked up a piece of fine grit steel wool, applied a small amount of restoration compound, and began to work the surface. Slowly, Beneath the years of grime and neglect, the bright, enduring metal began to catch the morning light.